Evidence for UFOs is mounting, and with every new revelation, more questions arise. However, for some people, these unidentified phenomena carry a deeper concern. They believe UFOs might be demonic. How do we discern the truth in the midst of mystery and speculation? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Halsted, a professor at Eternity Bible College in California, to explore this complex intersection of faith, theology, and the unexplained. Are we on the verge of a spiritual revolution, or is there a deception at play? We'll delve into religious identities, the possibility of extraterrestrial life, and the implications for traditional beliefs. We'll also unpack claims about the Vatican's involvement in UFO retrievals and explore the idea that religious assumptions by an alleged group called the Collins Elite may be influencing government decisions on non-human intelligence. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Dr. Matthew Halsted, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. Recently, you wrote an article that I think had a lot of buzz in the UFO community, and it was titled, "Evidence for UFOs is Mounting, but some Christians worry they're demonic. How can we discern the truth?"
Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm glad to be here.
What made you want to write this article? You know, I obviously imagine that there's so much media buzz going around and people are talking about it. But have you been fascinated with UFOs when you were growing up, or you just saw this in the media and thought, you know what, this is a time to have this conversation with the outlet that you're writing for, but also maybe it's the right time to have it, especially with the claims that Lou Elizondo has recently come out with, and along with David Grush?
Yeah, great question. The first part of it is, I always like to tell people that, I grew up in the 90s, and so we had some pretty interesting movies at that time. And so it got us all to thinking, and I suspect that my generation has been waiting for a while for this, and now all the stuff is in the media and it's no longer fringe. And so so there has been a curiosity about this topic. I think that's a generational thing. So that's part of it, of course. But as you mentioned, the whole conversation went to new levels with the 2017 New York Times article, and then the subsequent discussions and congressional testimony after that. And at the core of that, well, I shouldn't say at the core of the story, but a central part of the story was a religious element and a theological element. And I'm a theology professor, and so naturally I'm going to gravitate toward that. And I found it very curious. I've been interested in a long time, ever since the 2017 article and that time frame, I suppose. And it's been reported very often in various outlets of the media. George Knapp, Ross Coulthard, others have mentioned this, that there was pushback in the Pentagon against studying the phenomenon due to religious concerns that this might be a demonic sort of reality or whatever. And it had been it's been discussed so much, from Jay Stratton to Lou Elizondo to Harry Reid. George Knapp has reported on it, and Ross Coulthard and others have too. And so it just seems to be kind of part of the narrative. I wasn't there in the Pentagon, so I can't say for certain, but nonetheless, it's part of the narrative. It's part of the story. And that is an important element that I'm interested in, because narratives are very powerful. Whether they're true or not, it doesn't matter. The narratives are just very powerful. And as a theology professor, I'm either around colleagues, or I've studied this myself, or written on stuff that has to do with the supernatural realm. I began to think, it's really interesting that more theologians are not weighing in on this topic, and especially since the narrative does seem to revolve around, or at least touch upon, a religious element. And so I've written a few articles, and I've just kind of encouraged folks to at least participate in the discussion. And so that was part of my motivation, really, is I wanted to offer some thoughts on this topic and just throw out an opinion or two in the process.
So what was your first thought when you hear demonic? Like, what do you instantly go to when you hear that? Because it's a huge claim. saying that something is demonic that we can't have proof of. And it doesn't mean that Lou is right or wrong. I'm not saying that at all. It's more about what was the first initial thought. I know for me, when I hear demonic, I get scared like instantly. I'm like, oh my gosh, are we opening up Pandora's box? I think I've even asked Lou Elizondo that, a couple years ago, speaking with him. I instantly get scared because interdimensional or potentially demonic things that live here that are in space and time and potentially connected to spiritual stories of the past can be very scary and unsettling for people. So I love from your perspective and also as a Christian and also as a doctor in this space and who has a doctorate in this space, what was the first thing you thought of and the feeling that came with it?
Excellent question. Yeah, and I think that's a question that people or a topic that people are just musing through their brains. Namely, okay, so this is something sinister. Like we're being, this is part of that narrative. And to answer your question directly, yeah, when I think demonic, when I think demon, I think something very dark and sinister and something that does not want to promote the health of human beings. And when when that idea is tossed out there, I think it's very important that it's tossed out there with care and that it's tossed out there with some thought around it, right? Because it can scare people. And not only am I, a professor of biblical studies and theology, but I'm a confessional one. I'm a confessional theologian, meaning I am a Christian. I believe, what I teach. And so there's a pastoral element here. I'm like, okay, so let's actually think through this and let's make sure we're being careful with it, because I think if we scare people too, unnecessarily, that's not a virtue. That's actually harmful. And so I wanted to look at this question further. And so in my conversation with Lou, as reported in that article, I asked him, I said, okay, so people were pushing back because this was supposedly demonic. Did they ever give you evidence for why they actually thought it was demonic? And his answer, of course, was no. There was no logic to it. He just really couldn't understand it. And then he followed it up by saying, who knows? I mean, it could be demonic, but we need to at least investigate. And I found that response very interesting, in fact, because I have obviously a lot of friends within the church. I have friends who have participated in, exorcisms and things of that sort. And one thing that was mentioned actually to me in a recent conversation through a couple of colleagues was that, even in the church, when we suspect something is demonic and we're gearing up for an exorcism, we don't jump to an exorcism. We don't jump to a demonic hypothesis. We first rule out all sorts of other things. We rule out you can name all the things that we could possibly rule out, right? Hallucinations or whatever, or perhaps health issues. All of those things are ruled out in the church before you jump to a demon hypothesis. And circling back around to these discussions at the Pentagon that Lou is reporting, it's interesting that doesn't seem to have been the case, at least according to the reports that I'm hearing. That namely it was just jumped to really quickly. And my concern would be, if all that story is true, again, I wasn't in the halls of the Pentagon to verify this, but if all those things are true and this hypothesis was jumped into prematurely, then I can't help but wonder, okay, have we scared people, prematurely, right? And so I just want us to be very careful, methodical. I want us to be scientific and faithful with this topic with respect, especially to that aspect of the topic.
That makes sense. And I appreciate that because I think you're right. We have to settle people and we have to at least try to have as much evidence as possible and make the correct moves moving forward so that we don't create some mass hysteria, right? If people, thinking something that it might not be or could be, right? We need to have a
Yeah.
handle on it. I have to now, when you say exorcism, I have to bring this up because not even thought of that, to be honest. Have you ever seen in your past experiences something related to UAP that might be demonic or not, that someone has said they've seen a UFO and then an exorcism has been associated with it in any way? And if so, where or when, if you're open to speak about that?
Yeah, excellent question. I have not. I have not seen anything that was reported as UAP that ended up being demonic for certain. I'm not an exorcist, but I know someone who's very familiar with those sorts of things, and so I think, it's definitely something worth asking because I do believe, and I've heard stories such that would lend one to think that this is something very sinister in some regard. So some people report experiences that are deeply disturbing. And in some of those cases, I would say, yeah, this sounds very demonic from what I understand from people who've worked in that field. I know of a couple of scholars who are working in that sort of field who have written on demonic things and that sounded bad, written on demonic things, written things about the demonic realms. And so from what I can gather, some I think reports are probably demonic. But here's the thing. Anybody who studies the UAP topic for any extent, significant amount of time will tell you that at least the running theory is that this may not be a phenomenon singular, that this may be a phenomena plural. And so just because Matt Halsted thinks that one or some cases could be demonic doesn't mean that the entire thing is demonic, because the fact of the matter is that there are many cases that don't seem to have a malevolent context to it. Some cases seem to be just rather benign. And there's an excellent book that was written by a Princeton biblical scholar and historian, Dale Allison. It's called Encountering Mystery. And in this book, he writes about many of his own experiences. And some of them are, and they're not like UAP, but they're just what we would call paranormal experiences. And by the way, people know Dale Allison, like he's a superb scholar, highly respected in his field. He's a senior scholar on so many levels. And he's writing this book and he's sharing about his experiences or people that know him. And some of the experiences that he describes, that he talks about, whether it's his own or others, they're just benign. They're just weird. They're just odd. And so if that's the case, I can't think of reason why one should conclude that that's demonic. Could be, but there's just not evidence for me to think that. So
It's so hard because how do you have evidence? Like, what evidence would we have that it's demonic? Like, how could we prove that? That it just comes out and says, hey, I'm demonic? Like, I don't think it doesn't work like that. Like, science needs to catch up. And we have to understand space and time way better than we do now. Because I personally lean to more Jacques Vallée's theories of interdimensional and living within our space and time. And we don't really understand it being here or around us, or maybe potentially coming from somewhere else in the cosmos. Who knows? That doesn't mean that you can't be interdimensional and travel throughout the cosmos too, right? We don't know, but I think that we do have to be mindful that maybe one day there will be evidence and it'd be really exciting. And I think the question for a lot of people now, does the government know this, right? Because here's the thing. People like you and I could be working within the government and have a religious background and say, well, I believe this, and this is part of my religious beliefs as well, and project that onto what they're working on or working within government, right? We see that all the time. There is no sometimes separation of that. Unfortunately, there should be, I believe, at times, right? We need to separate, and we have that. But there are moments where people's opinions and feelings do come into government, and we see that. Do you really believe that there's something called the Collins elite that's within the government and they know more? Or are they an organization that's there because they have an understanding of religion and a belief within religion that they feel that needs to be put within government as well to be safe, or, to have some kind of maybe order, I'll use the word. But is that possible that the Collins elite does exist? And, how much maybe do they actually really know? Or do they know anything at all?
yeah, that's a question again that's been around for actually quite some time, that there is a religious group, whether formal or informal, that are pushing against this topic because they're religious people and they think that this is something demonic, and we don't even want to get involved in this. You don't want to study it because you're opening doors up to the demonic, right? And that's their way of thinking. As to your question, do I know that they exist? I really don't know. I mean, I've not I've not ever met anybody who said, hey, yeah, I'm actually part of the Collins elite, we meet at 7 p.m, you want to join us? Yeah, I just don't know.
You might now with the articles.
Yeah, my
You never
inbox
know.
might get pounded. Yeah, that's right. I'm not available typically at 7 p.m. if you're listening, so maybe we can work on another time. But what I would say is that they're, whether they have a name or not, whether they have a badge or whatever, it seems that this has been reported enough that on the record by people that it seems to, I seem to think that there was religious pushback in the Pentagon. How many people, who they all were. I just don't know. I certainly don't know for certain. And so, but my question would be to them is to say, okay, well, Matt Halsted is a sincere Christian. I wear that badge, and I'm not ashamed of that badge by no means. And so I asked this question in good faith to everybody involved in this aspect of the story is, okay, number one, what sort of evidence do you have? I mean, there has to be some sort of evidence that you have that this is demonic, or otherwise it's just an assumption. And if it's just an assumption without evidence, I get it. I totally get it. This is kind of a fearful aspect, kind of what you and I were talking about is when you first hear the word demon, everything just kind of immediately comes because of our assumptions. And so I get it. Assumptions are very powerful, but let's go have a drink and then just kind of settle down, and then let's come back to this question and say, okay, what sort of evidence do we have? Because and I think that's a worthwhile question. If there is a group at the Pentagon who are pushing back for religious beliefs, it should not be a threatening question to them, simply because if I'm asking you to set down your assumptions for a moment, it doesn't mean you have to leave them down. You can pick them back up, but let's just look at this objectively. And if we can find evidence that it is demonic, I'm on your team. If we can find evidence that it's not, okay, let's ask further questions. And I think I can point to examples where in history that, whether it's a scientific discovery or something to that effect, where it's come out, this new discovery, and there's been initial concern or angst or anxiety. We think of the Copernican revolution. We think of I mentioned in my article the gorilla story, which was fascinating once I learned that we hear these stories of humanoid creatures in Africa, who are, they live in huts and they steal women and they do all these sorts of things. And it turns out those were just sort of mythic rumors or whatever, and they weren't true. But there was something true behind the myth, namely a real life scientific discovery. And it's an example of how sometimes we can discover something real in science, and initially, we're afraid, because it feels uncomfortable or whatever. And so could it be that UAPs are like that? Possibly. What if it's just another species, some third rational species? The great Christian thinker C.S. Lewis talked about, seemed to be open to that idea. He wrote about extraterrestrials in his fiction, and he seemed to give credence to the idea that there could be these fairy creatures, kind of a Jacques Vallée sort of thing. And so within the Christian tradition, there's room for that sort of thing. And my thought would be, is that for these people, if they exist, who are pushing back out of fear of demons, I wonder if they don't know the Christian tradition as well as perhaps they should, that there is actually room within it. The one author, he's a dear friend of mine, Dr. Paul Thigpen, PhD, Emory University. He actually wrote a paper for the Soul Foundation too, so I encourage everybody to go check that out. Paul, has written really well on this topic about, this idea of NHI, and he's talked about within the Christian tradition, and he's a historical theologian by training, and he can help. I think someone like him could really help folks see that, okay, just because it's weird and strange does not mean it is demonic. It could be, but let's just investigate, which was Lou's point in the article that I wrote. Let's investigate.
Are we on a spiritual and religious revolution right now? Are we towards that? Are we going towards that right now? Just because
Yeah.
I would imagine that some of the things that are happening right now, when we look at deception, for example, or other elements are pointing towards some kind of coming. Do you feel that, not saying that is the case, but on some form of evolution or a spiritual revolution that we are on and going towards? And would Christianity back that or not?
Okay, yeah, great question. I see what you're saying. I can't speak for other religions. By no means
Sure.
would I want to do that. And what I would say is that if it turns out that we're going to have capital D disclosure, that the government knows about NHI, that they're here, they've been here, or whatever the case may be, and we come out with a startling revelation that we're not alone in the universe. I think if that were to happen, and if that is indeed coming, what I would say is that I don't think Christianity would be harmed by that one bit. And that's, people may say, well, okay, Matt, but you're kind of biased toward Christianity in that regard. In which I would say, well, let's just look at it. You look at it. I invite everybody to look at that question. There's nothing in Christian theology that would be threatened by the reality that there are, non-human intelligences, and partly because Christianity has already incorporated that idea within its own religious text and its traditions. We already believe in non-human intelligence. They're called angels. They're called the Watchers. They're called the, whatever. And demons, or and God is a non-human intelligence, and so I think that, just broadly speaking, we have the categories to make sense of that. Moreover, even as I said earlier, in the Christian tradition, we have folks like C.S. Lewis, Saint Jerome, and even Saint Augustine, who have spoken about, in a roundabout way, this topic. And not E.T. per se, well, C.S. Lewis did, but nonetheless, they were talking about this in a way that would accommodate a view such, or the belief or the reality of, say, NHI existence. And so, now what would end up happening, though, is that Christians who may or may not be informed about the Christian tradition might need to get informed about that. So initially they would feel perhaps, maybe a little angst, like, okay, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about this topic. Well, I get that. The Bible also doesn't say that the sun is 93 million miles away from the earth. There's a lot of things that the Bible doesn't talk about. But as soon as we understand that the Bible was, or is a theology book and not a scientific book in that sense, right? That once we understand that, then I think it's going to be more easily accommodated. That said, I get it. A lot of people are going to have to, think through, if someone thinks the Bible is a science book, then that might be problematic for them. But in terms of the Christian tradition proper, in terms of Christian theology and doctrine proper, I can see nothing with respect to NHI existence that would threaten Christianity.
So we get to a point, say, within history where we understand what this is to some degree. There is this conversation, obviously, in theology about deception, right? But looking at saying that Christians already believe in angels and God as being non-human too. But there's also the theory of deception, right? And not following false idols, and being potentially deceived. What happens then? Does the Christian religion embrace? Do they observe and wait? Where does that fit in? Because it kind of does and it doesn't at the same time.
Yeah, good question. So what I would say is that, it goes back to the question of just investigating, like, how, if this is deceptive, say, and well, the way you can, parse out deception, the way that you can catch deception, is by asking questions, right? And so, okay, so if ET landed on the White House lawn tonight, at the inconvenient time of, say, 7 p.m. In an hour later, and I catch up with it.
And you're also talking to the Collins elite.
yeah, everybody's kind of getting together for coffee or that late hour.
Exactly.
I would say that's pretty cool, and I'd still go to church on Sunday. But it wouldn't bother me. Now, one thing that would come up would be if ET came and they said, hey guys, there is no God. By the way, there's no God. And we've learned this through our educational system, and we're a little older than you, and we've learned that there is no God. I would just simply look at that and say, and shrug and say, well, that's interesting. That doesn't threaten Christianity. That's not a challenge to Christianity. We already have, people on earth who say there is no God. And the fact of the matter is, as Christian philosophers have said, is that that belief in God is grounded upon other foundations than just what ETI might say, or even people would say. And so yeah, I mean, there's an excellent article. I referenced it in a couple of articles ago that I wrote on this, and they basically say this, like, belief in God is established on other grounds, and the Christian tradition is full of all sorts of arguments for the existence of God. Nonetheless, if ET were to come and tell us that there is no God, I would just say, well, I disagree. And so we've been disagreeing with that idea for a very long time, and it's nothing new. And it could be, that doesn't mean actually that ET is demonic. It doesn't mean that they're demonic. It could mean they're mistaken. It could mean that they are deceptive, maybe have ulterior motives or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're demonic. It could mean they're demonic and deceptive. But again, we need to ask questions. We need, and that's what we need to do. And now we haven't had a White House landing yet, if indeed we ever will. But we do have the narrative, as I spoke about earlier. We do have a conversation about this, and this is a conversation that I do want people to know is that it's not foreign to theologians. Theologians have been talking about this question for a long time because there's great value in asking the question of what if there's ET, because that would help us to think through our theology in different ways. And how might the death of Jesus influence an ET civilization? And C.S. Lewis wrote about that a little bit. So we've been talking about that question for a long time. And if there is deception involved in any of this modern day UFO, UAP conversation, well, let's just start asking questions then, and then we can sift through and find the truth.
What's your thoughts with the David Grush claims about the Vatican, having more information about alleged UFO crashes or ET connection, and also potentially having materials, and has known this for a very long time since the reign of Mussolini? Like, what did you, when you read that, you must have been like, whoa, or watched it on News Nation when they broke it. What did you think? And also, the Vatican has not made a statement in claiming it or disclaiming it yet. So we're still kind of waiting to hear back. But from what I've heard from other government officials that have said to me that potentially that part could be misinformation. They're not sure. We all are not sure until it's disproven to some degree. Right now, it's just a theory. But what's your thoughts on the David Grush comments?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on it. First of all, David Grush is a very interesting, highly credible person who came not only just to News Nation, or he was in the debrief too, right? And he even testified to Congress under oath about his claims, and they were, there's been lots of conversations, as I understand it, that he's had with people behind the scenes too. It's an incredible case and an incredible testimony that he gave. And so his credibility level is extremely high. So that all of that's just super fascinating. But the second thing I would say is, for me, the question is not so much, is it true? The question is, at this point in time, am I justified in believing that it's true? Now, on the one hand, David Grush is highly credible. I totally get that. On the other hand, maybe it's just the skeptic in me, but well, it's not skepticism per se. I'm open to anything. But I want to see pictures. I want them to, bring out the U-Haul trailer and just open it up and say, Matt, have fun for the next hour. I want to look at the stuff. I want to see it if it's there. And until I can actually get proof, it's responsible for me just to simply say, I don't know. I do know, though, that what's happening in the U.S. Senate with Senator Chuck Schumer's groundbreaking UAP Disclosure Act, round part two, him and Mike Rounds have put this out, and it's a stunning piece of legislation. And I highly encourage anybody just to go read it. It's fascinating on so many levels. And so, given that someone with the stature of Senator Chuck Schumer, putting out this legislation, I just want to say, okay, it seems like it's not just a question about David Grush. What it seems to be is a question of what is Chuck Schumer thinking? What is the United States Senate thinking? And what is the real reason for this stunning piece of legislation? So David Grush is an integral part of this whole story, a very important part, no doubt. But he's a spoke in the greater wheel, and there are more spokes out there that when you take them all together, you just really have to stop and think, what in the world is going on? It's not, the narrative at least suggests that it's not easily dismissed. What that is, what the truth is, I don't know. But again, it's worth asking questions.
Yeah, we're in a wild time right now. Like every time I watch the news on this, sometimes I like literally going through like mini daily paradigm shifts where I'm like, what do I believe? Like, and also what do I know when I look at this, and how do I feel in conjunction when I hear these things or talk to other people about these claims? It's wild. It really is. And we are living through a very interesting time when people are evaluating self right now, I think more than ever. I believe last 2 years ago, the number one word was like narcissism, right? In the Webster
Mm.
Dictionary. Um, We hear things where like people, or gaslighting was another one of them too, right? And the reason why I say that is that people are becoming a parent of other people's actions and cause and effect and how it applies to them. And I think people are trying to look deeper. And that could be from a spiritual perspective, but also just a personal perspective too, right? And understanding themselves in context of everything that's going on around them right now, because we're moving at rapid rates. A friend of mine said to me, Marie Nicola, one of my best friends, said, you know, Chrissy, I think it was, let's say, just like in the 50s or in the early 20s and 30s. It was, let's just say, a long time ago. The amount of knowledge that one person had in their head was pretty much the same depth and content of the New York Times newspaper. And that was it. That was their entire
Hmm.
life. That's how much information that they knew and could consume. So no wonder we're all having trouble sometimes understanding what's going on because we're evolving so fast. Information is evolving so fast, and we're trying to catch up with it and understand it. And I don't know if we have those abilities yet to do that. Right. And maybe we don't have the abilities to see these things yet because we're not there. And we're kind of going, obviously, through that paradigm shift and evolution of human.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's information overload, especially with this topic, and it can be challenging to find the narrative within all the data points, right? It's extremely challenging, and I think we just need to be responsible with those with the data points, and responsible for finding that narrative, whatever it may be. I tell people all the time, it doesn't matter what you believe if there are actually little green men. This is just a very interesting mystery that's worth looking into a little bit.
I think so too. It really is. And I wonder, and I've asked this to other people recently too, about the evolution of transhumanism, right? The idea of that putting machinery or some technology in us where we're kind of like cyborgs now, right? With our cell phones. And I think Elon Musk has said that many times, and we would all agree. But instead of us having it externally, we have it internally. How does Christianity look at that in the view of transhumanism? Because potentially it could give us the ability to connect with something that is other than us and have the ability to see something that might be demonic or spiritual, but it also could hinder that, and it could do nothing at all. But we don't know. Where does Christianity sit with that evolution?
Yeah, technology is an interesting question, and you're right. Like our cell phones in many ways is sort of, we hold it all the time. It's like right there with us, and I actually, you know, I actually don't think that's healthy. I don't think that the overload in technology is actually all that healthy. With AI that can write your emails and your letters and your books, even, AI can just do pretty much everything. And I think that that there's a loss there, and there's a loss in the sense of engaging one's mind and growing, say, as a writer or whatever. It's like, I don't want to rely on AI to do that. I want to continue to grow myself. Yeah, it's going to take me a lot longer. It's more work. It's tiring, but is it worth it for human flourishing? I'm not anti-technology at all. Turns out I do have a cell phone that I do carry around all the time. So I get it. I totally get it. In terms of transhumanism, yeah, I'm not against, like, using technology to promote our health or anything of that sort. But I will say that, this is just a topic I know very little about, so I want to preface that. But I will say that within a Christian theology is that the body is important, and there is, there are many Christians who seem to have this idea that the goal, in all of life, is to shun the body and then just leave it and finally go to heaven and be there for eternity when we die. What's interesting about that is that that's more Greek philosophy than it was ever Christianity. At the heart of Christianity was the resurrection of the body, and that God promises one day that we would all have our own resurrection day. And so God is out to redeem the body. So anything that would seem to try to replace the body or to set the body aside, whether with human technology or whatever, I think there's an unhealthiness there that would actually impede our flourishing as human beings. Again, I'm not to say that I'm against, like, medical technology to help us. We use it all the time. I've used it, in my own health, and so we all do. And so yeah, I'm a bit of a how would I put it? I'm the guy with the red flag holding things up and saying, okay, guys, let's stop and think about this a little bit more. Going back to what I said earlier, let's just ask more questions before we do these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea too. I know Elon Musk recently with Neuralink has made a comment where at one point in time in history, and I don't know when that will be, but we'll be able to take our own memories and be able to upload them into some other body, right? And be able to do that. And it could be another physical body, it could be a computer-based body, but that is on the way of being in development, which is
Yeah,
like wild to think, right? And so then it stops to think like, okay, what does consciousness mean? And then
right.
also, does that make us live forever? Is because he believes and says that, if we can keep our memories, that is what keeps us being human outside of the conversation of religious and spiritual meaning. But in a scientific way, I would say for him, a part of meaning is that we would be able to live forever because we would be able to recall memories and be able to live through those experiences and keep living through those memories and developing new ones because your personality potentially, well, we don't know, might stay in place to some degree. So does that mean the constant of of who the person, but also then what about the soul? Right. So it's a wild time right now. I write about the Neuralink and I cover it. And every time I'm following it, I'm dumbfounded by what he says, and not in a bad way or a good way, just dumbfounded in general about the advancement of technology. And then all these other questions about meaning, right? That are so important to all of us. And we might not
Mhm.
speak about it every day, but I know for sure we think about it.
We do, and it is a conversation that's out there. And what a couple things I would say is this is me holding up my red flag. A couple things I would say is one, there's when it comes to consciousness or one's thoughts and minds and memories, so much of those sorts of things are actually tied up within our body. Like when I smell something, it reminds me of my grandmother's house, or if I all these sorts of things. So it's very difficult to parse out those sorts of things without a body or some sort of embodiment. And so those are questions that would need to be addressed and whatnot. The second thing I would say is, my field is the humanities in a sense, right? My field is that. So I'm not a natural scientist. But there was a great meme not too long ago, and I've always remembered this because it justifies my humanities degree. The meme goes like this: is that the natural scientists can teach us how to bring back the dinosaurs like in Jurassic Park, but it's the humanities folks who will remind us why that's a bad idea. And so I think the science will it takes us down many very beautiful paths and interesting things and wonderful discoveries and so forth. But I would encourage them to listen to the philosophers, and Christians have a very rich tradition of philosophy, from Augustine to Aquinas to so many people, Saint Gregory. And so we've been talking about in a roundabout way these sorts of things, and perhaps there are things there that would be fruitful and helpful to this larger discussion. And so I think that I think that there are philosophical questions that would need to be answered first. Science, we must be reminded, is something that can keep us alive and extend life, hospital medical technology and so forth. But let us not forget that technology, if put in the hands of the wrong person, can also create a hydrogen bomb and actually use it. And so I would just like to say is like, okay, what are the ramifications of these sorts of ideas that are being said? And what sort of moral and ethical obligations do we have as human beings before we launch off into the laboratory? So that's my red flag. Red flag.
I agree with you too. And I think the soft sciences for sure are so important. And I really believe, and I think a lot of people like Dr. Gary Nolan and Peter Skafish would have believed that the humanities need to really
They
take a
do.
hold of the UAP topic at least.
Mm.
Um, because it's time. Government I think is a great place, and I did a podcast earlier on this. If counterintelligence are the right people to be handling this topic, and it's not saying that they're not, but they for sure should be involved. But I think we do need to give it to soft sciences right now, along with hard sciences. But the soft sciences are coming in, and we're seeing that now. And I'm having even more discussions with people that are in anthropology and more than I've ever had before. And there are my favorite discussions, to be honest, because, I think a lot of us want to know meaning of life and what does this mean, especially in the future? What does it mean to us? And again, we might not talk about it a lot, but I think people do think about it, right? And they consider it when we're going through such an evolution of self in throughout this time. My last question to you is, within Christianity, the idea that man is made in the eye of God. If we come in contact with other ETs or other entities of some form that are non-human, that we don't consider to be man or human or like us, are they made in the eye of God, um, or are they not? How would we look at that through a Christian lens?
Yeah, fantastic question. And Christians have addressed that question in slightly different ways, and different, traditions might answer it slightly differently. One thing I would say is that so you get this idea that humans are made in the image of God, and it comes from Genesis, and a lot of this language about image of God from a historical, like ancient Near Eastern perspective, is that images were, essentially reflections of the one who was sovereign. You're just sort of, by your very being, you're just reflecting the goodness and the beauty and the truth of God. And wrapped up into that is his, his sovereignty, or and whatnot. In the ancient world, uh images were constructed of, the gods or the kings or whatever, and placed in very important strategic locations across their kingdom, and those images would remind travelers or whoever that, okay, this person is the sovereign over this land, right? And I think that human beings have, within the historical context of Genesis, I think something like that is the case. Is that what it means to be an image bearer is definitely a vocation, right? It also has to do with our ontology, our very being, but it's also a vocational responsibility, such that to be the image of God, is to flourish as one who essentially mirrors his goodness, his truth, and his beauty to everyone that they encounter. And it is true, Christians believe that all humans are made in the image of God, and that's why we want to. That's why the core of our doctrine is loving one's neighbor as himself, loving God as with all of our heart, and so love is such the central virtue for Christians, and it's, we, because of the image bearing idea. Now, when it comes to ET, would they bear the image of God? And I suppose that that if God saw fit to create extraterrestrial intelligence or some sort of NHI, He would have had a purpose for them too, in some way. It could be very similar to the purpose that He gave us. It could be remarkably different, but all the same. I would just echo what the Psalms say in Scripture: is that God is good to all that He has made. Wonders though if they start talking to us about God first, and so there's just lots of things. Maybe they have their own theology, and they can tell us why God has made them in their image too. These are very important questions, and depending on perhaps one's particular Christian tradition, we might answer them slightly differently. But all to say, it goes back to my first point earlier: is that the Christian tradition could definitely accommodate that reality.
UFO folklore, we've heard, I'm forgetting his name now. It's, geesh, Millennial Hospitality was the book. I'm forgetting his name, but it allegedly worked at S4 or on Dreamland, and said that he was a weather observer, and that he ended up coming across different forms of ETs, right? He says, this is his story, right? And he was really the only person to do that and was allowed to do it. And nobody else was chosen but him because of the ETs that were visiting. It was kind of like a pit stop where they would learn about humans. There were students, there was children. So he says that within this one contact with him, he does say that one of the teachers were passing and said to the student, they believe in God, but it's a different God than our God. And I thought that was really interesting. Out of all of those stories that I've heard from him, I thought that was really interesting. And it's not saying I believe it, but it's interesting to think that, obviously they're still wondering too. And I guess we never really talk about that, is just because we think that they are maybe some form of smarter intelligence than we are. And I've said this multiple times. It doesn't mean that they can't make mistakes too. It doesn't mean just because you're interdimensional or you're more intelligent doesn't mean you don't screw up. So, and also it doesn't mean that you don't know, right? So I think that it doesn't mean that we should believe them when, if this ever does come to some form of scientific revolution for us, because we might come to a point where they say we're wondering just as much, or whatever it may be, just as much as you guys are. So it doesn't mean it's going to answer our questions. It actually just might open more.
Yeah, and this is the reality that we currently live in anyway. I have met so many wonderful people in even within the Christian tradition. There's different traditions within the great tradition, right? And of course, the whole world isn't Christian, and we have different theologies or whatever, and yet we can still care for each other. We can still ask questions and have dialogues, and so I suspect that if there was an ET creature or being who was interested in theology, I'd be interested in talking with him.
Me too. I think that's a great way to end the show. Thank you so much, Dr. Halsted. It has been wonderful speaking with you, and thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thank you so very much.